You want to know why? Ask how. Howard the Humongous. We are scrapping away at the ISIS, the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, sometimes known as ISIL, sometimes known as the Islamic State, in Syria and Iraq. This week we've been hitting it in Syria for the first time. One of the problems that we recognize is that if we're really going to defeat ISIS, we need not just planes in the air. We need boots on the ground. We need people, humans, soldiers, who can hold territory. And one thing that we haven't recognized, but's come up a number of times in these broadcasts, is that we need more than just soldiers who can hold the ground. We need a government that can rule. We need a government that can provide peace, that can provide security, that makes sure that when you decide to go down to the market to buy some bread, you have a reasonable degree of assurance that you will come home in one piece, that you won't be blown up by suicide bombers in the marketplace. And to figure out who we're going to have on the ground, who's going to hold that ground, who's going to govern that ground, how, in other words, we're going to fill a space with an ability to lead a vital life rather than leaving a chaos in a vacuum. We have to understand the lesson of the four dictators. What is the lesson of the four dictators? It's a lesson that we should have learned during the course of the last 11 years. It's a lesson that we should have learned ever since we began romantically toppling people like Saddam Hussein, who we toppled in 2003 in Iraq. Since then, we've either toppled or we've cheered as these men have been toppled, three other major dictators in the Middle East. One of them in Libya is Muammar Gaddafi. One of them in Egypt is Hosni Mubarak. One of them in Yemen, where we've paid very little attention, has been Ali Abdullah Saleh. What has happened with each of these cases where we toppled a dictator and hoped that a democratic government would move in? We got anything but a democratic government. We got a chaos. We got the kind of mean, nasty, and brutish state that Hobbes, the 17th century British philosopher, talked about in his book Leviathan. It has been monstrous. It has been nasty. It has been vicious. It has been impossible to expect that you might live from day to day. Your life has been constantly in danger, and any of these four countries whose dictators have been toppled. That is one of the reasons that the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria has so much appeal. It offers to stop the violence. It offers to stop the suicide bombings in the marketplace. It offers to provide government. It offers to stop the bribery of soldiers and policemen. It offers to provide quick trials if you have a dispute with your neighbor. Right now, and we've started our bombings in Syria within this last week. And the question is, we're basically saying, in fact, one of the things that Barack Obama asked for a lot of money for, hundreds of millions of dollars, was to train and equip the Syrian rebels. The Syrian rebels, first of all, these guys are so close to ISIS, it's ridiculous. All of them are, or seem to be, Islamists of one kind or another, political Muslims, people who believe in a government of Sharia, a government that is violent and barbaric by our standards. Secondly, the government, none of these groups, the so-called rebels, has shown an ability to fight against ISIS or al-Nusra. Al-Nusra is the al-Qaeda force, an al-Qaeda-backed rebel force. They can't even stand up against ISIS or al-Nusra. How are they going to possibly run a government? How are they going to provide security? How are they going to provide safety? And much less a state whose income grows. whose capabilities grow, whose citizens are able to get better and better jobs and have more and more choices in their life. The idea that we could do this is foolish. The notion of equipping and training local forces is one that we've worked on for 10 years in a country called Iraq. We've spent billions of dollars. Exactly how many billions is hard to determine, but it's a lot of money to equip and train Iraqi forces over approximately 10 years. They've had roughly 10 years of our training and our equipment. And you saw what happened the minute that ISIS started sweeping into Iraq. The people we had trained were wearing civilian clothes under their military uniforms. They stripped off their military uniforms. They dropped their weapons and they tried to blend into the population. They turned tail and ran. What guarantee is there that only a few months later we've gotten any better at training and equipping people who have no central, unifying, coherent philosophy that gives them something worth living and dying for, something bigger than themselves that they'd be willing to fight for? There is no guarantee, which means the bottom line is this: there's only one dictator we haven't toppled in the area, and that is Bashar Assad, the person we've pitted ourselves against in Syria. Bashar Assad is monstrous. He is bloody. He tortures people. He kills people. Although, by the way, there's something very important to note. Of the 200,000 people who've been killed in the Syrian civil war, it is very hard to determine how many have been killed by Bashar Assad, and in all probability 100,000 of those have been killed by the so-called rebels that we are supporting, and more important, that our Saudi allies are supporting, because these are proxy forces for Saudi Arabia. The Saudis have conned us into showing some degree of support for these forces. But roughly 100,000 people in all probability have been killed by the rebels, and 100,000 people have been killed by Saddam Hussein. And if there had been no civil war, if Saudi Arabia hadn't decided to run a rebellion against Saddam Hussein and topple him from power in order to take a bargaining chip away from the Iranians. The Iranians right now have Saddam Hussein as one of their closest allies. If the Saudis hadn't decided to do that and hadn't conned us into going along with them, those 200,000 people in all probability would still be alive today. The bottom line is this: we should have learned the lesson of the 4 dictators. What do we get for toppling Saddam Hussein? Approximately 75 people have been killed a day in car bombings and suicide bombings in Iraq for 10 years straight. What did we get for toppling Muammar Gaddafi in Libya? Libya has turned into a chaos. It's a battleground between rival militias. It is not a safe place to live. Egypt fell into the hands of the Muslim Brotherhood. The Egyptian people were so horrified that they've now installed a new military dictator, al-Sisi. And the Egyptians that I've talked to are blissfully happy to have a military dictator back again, because they believe that they will now have peace, security, and the ability to grow as a nation. And in Yemen, where we've paid no attention over the course of the last week, the entire state has fallen to a group called the Houthis, and the Houthis are a proxy for the Iranians. So no good has come out of toppling these dictators. It is time to value the dictators in the Middle East much more highly than we've been valuing them in the past. It is time to throw our support behind, of all people, Bashar Assad, because he will run a far better state, a state with a high degree of education, a high degree of medical service, a high degree of secularism, and freedom for women. He has provided those things, just as all the other dictators that we've helped topple or we've encouraged the toppling of have provided. That is far, far better than the Islamic State with its beheadings and its crucifixions. That is far, far better than the war of all against all that's going on right now in countries like Libya. Keep your dictators when they are the only ones who can hold a state together. They are better than chaos. This is Howard the Humongous speaking to you from the future. It's your job and my job to make, or want to know why, ask how. And now for that sleazy, slimy, sneaky, elusive, evasive, appalling little off button. That should be it. Have I found it?